Trying to be like a makeup YouTuber. It says koala, koala, koala. Found this guy on the street today. Isn't he cute? Usually just find stupid baby toys. What am I supposed to do with those? I don't got a baby. We're going to jump right in. In our last lecture, we discussed the term modernism, which you'll remember is an artistic movement or attitude in response to the rapid modernization of the 19th century. I mentioned that this period in European history witnessed an explosion of change with a greater sense of living in a world of modernity that was vastly different than the world of the relatively recent past. Not all areas of society were able or willing to keep up with this rapid rate of change. While fields like technology and science sped ahead into the future, there were institutions that continued to preserve traditional modes of doing things. They were more resistant to change as their existence depended on preserving certain practices, obviously groups like religion, but also and especially educational institutions, which very well couldn't simply throw out their curriculum and start afresh. Young artists coming of age in the late 19th century therefore had a frustrating educational experience. The tools they were being handed down by their instructors felt old-fashioned and ill-suited to expressing the world of modernity rising up around them. Music students at the Paris Conservatoire, the premier music education institution in France, had been taught methods of harmony and counterpoint that changed very little since the 18th century. These were ingrained in them in a competition-based system of pedagogy that awarded pupils who stuck to the rules. The ultimate prize at the Conservatoire was the coveted Prix de Rome, or the Rome Prize, which was given to the best composition student at the Conservatoire annually. The list of winners is a veritable who's who of French music in the 19th century. Names like Hector Berlioz, Charles Gounod, Georges Bizet, who composed Carmen, and Jules Massenet, all of whom were the composers of opera, which was the preferred genre in Paris of the 19th century. Remember, that was what Wagner was reacting to, the French grand opera of the early 19th century. So this was the educational atmosphere that the young Claude Debussy entered into. Debussy was born to a poor working class family in Paris, but his musical talents were fortunately discovered early, and he was admitted into the Conservatoire in 1872 at the age of 10. Formal musical education started much earlier in those days, especially for children who showed promise. So Debussy was frustrated with the rules imposed on him by the conservatory. From the assignment comments of his professors, you can get a sense of his resistance to procedures, which were misunderstood by the faculty. His resistance to them, not the procedures. They knew it very well. On the final composition project from 1881 that Debussy composed, he was 18 at the time, the grader wrote, "Convoluted, too much modulation. That's too many key changes." He wasn't so much flat out breaking the rules or making mistakes for that matter, but stretching the rules or implying them eccentrically. Debussy's talent, albeit unconventional, made him a contender for the Prix de Rome, and he managed to rein in his style enough to place second in the 1883 contest. The judges said he had a, quote, "a musical nature generous, but ardent to the point of intemperance." Finally, in 1884, he placed first and was awarded the Prix de Rome. While this was a monumental achievement for the young man, who was now about your age, it wasn't without its stifling limitations. In fact, Debussy said when he was told the news of his win, "My heart sank. I saw clearly the tedium, the anxieties that the least official recognition fatally entails. Above all, I felt I was no longer free." The main condition of the prize was that Debussy would travel to Rome to stay at this luxurious Villa Medici and hone his compositional craft alongside the young and talented painters, sculptors, architects, and engravers who had won the Prix de Rome in these categories. It seems like a dream come true for any artist, but the pressure was only exacerbated, as he would still have the paternalistic eye of the Conservatoire observing him over his shoulder. While at the villa, which is depicted beautifully here, it seems quite ideal, but while at the villa, he was expected to absorb the artistic culture of this fabled city and then create a series of new compositions that would demonstrate his ability to live up to the award, as well as his continued adherence to the stifling stylistic expectations that had been ingrained in him at the Conservatoire, but which he was trying to resist. These pieces that he composed would continue to be assessed by the judges at the Conservatoire, whose comments would reveal their own overly conservative tastes, as well as Debussy's continued resistance to the methods he had been taught. Even though they're pejorative in their assessments of his Prix de Rome pieces, they are criticizing him negatively. These judges nevertheless give an accurate description of what Debussy's mature style would be, and which he was developing as a young man already. They remain accurate characterizations of his music and aesthetic even later in life. Here's a view of the interior of the villa. So this assessor says, this pensioner, that is the person receiving money from the Conservatoire or whatever institution was paying for this, this pensioner, we note with regret, seems today to be preoccupied solely with creating the strange, the bizarre, the incomprehensible. Here's a more interesting one, and I found this painting by Picasso of the Villa Medici, which differs from the two more romantic pictures of the villa, which we saw before, and seems more in line with Debussy's aesthetic, which we see described here in this assessor's comments of one of his Prix de Rome pieces. He says, Monsieur Debussy assuredly does not sin through platitude or banality. That is, his music isn't platitudinous or banal. On the contrary, he has a very pronounced tendency towards the research of the strange. Again, strange, like the other commenter mentioned. One recognizes in him a feeling for color and poetry, whose exaggeration easily makes him forget the importance of precision in design and clarity of form. It would be desirable for him to be on guard against the vague impressionism, which is one of the most dangerous enemies of truth in works of art. And I love, that's why I was so happy to find this Picasso painting, which pictorially encapsulates this comment. It's tending toward the strange, the colorful, the vague, whereas this other painting of the Villa Medici is more of a pictorial equivalent of what the judges, what Debussy's judges at the Conservatoire were looking in his music. This was more of the aesthetic they wanted, while Debussy seemed to be approaching something more like this Picasso painting, though musically. And let's unpack that word here, this vague impressionism. So the second assessor's mention of vague impressionism will no doubt stand out to you, given our discussion last week of this early modernist ism, which was emerging in French art of the 1870s and 80s at the time Debussy was completing his studies at the Conservatoire. Though I can guarantee you his young colleagues at the Villa Medici were not painting in this style. The rules being taught at the Académie des Beaux-Arts, the top visual arts school in Paris, were just as strict as at the Conservatoire. So the aesthetics of Impressionism were certainly something that were in the air, but they were something that the conservative professors at the Conservatoire certainly didn't want spreading to music. Composition at the time, and in the hundreds of years of Western music preceding the 19th century, was about conveying a sense of harmonic and formal logic. that this harmony seems to pull toward the next harmony, that this key prepares for the arrival of that key. This melody traces an arc that drives us toward a climactic high point. This rhythm reinforces the regular meter of the piece, and these two sections of a piece are proportionally balanced with a third section. That was the aesthetic of music at the time. While Debussy's assessors might seem like old-fashioned fuddy-duddies from our point of view, the present day, I can appreciate their anxieties to a certain extent. As I mentioned in our last lecture, music doesn't have the same semantic specificity of text or the visual arts, which can represent concrete objects or experiences. Music, especially pure instrumental music, that is without a staging, without a dance, without a text, relies entirely on the internal sense of sonic logic to convey its meaning. A piano etude is less about a landscape or a love affair than it is about harmonic progressions, its balanced form, its novel finger techniques, and the play of textures on the ear. Debussy's conservatoire instructors didn't want the vague, free-flowing aesthetic of Impressionism muddying music's internal logic, which is what gave a piece its sense of balance, proportion, and drive that were at the core of music's meaning for the 19th century composers. Debussy is regularly associated with Impressionism, and along with his colleague and sometimes rival Maurice Ravel, he had been labeled the main representative of Impressionism in composition, a kind of musical Monet. It's both difficult and fascinating to explore if and how an artistic movement, one of the isms we introduced last week, can translate from one medium to another. Impressionism, as you'll recall, dealt with issues of depicting the visual world through painting. These artists were concerned with capturing the color, light, and shadow in a manner that better represented how we subjectively view the world. But can its techniques translate into the sonic? Certainly there are some analogous aspects in Debussy's music, but these tend to be very broad and superficial similarities. The subject matter of Debussy's more pictorial works, ones that are attempting to depict something, objects, people, places, the subjects of these works tend to be associated with water, gardens, weather, especially clouds and mist. He has a piece called Nuage, Clouds, which are all favorite Impressionist subjects. Yet we might also note that Debussy wasn't composing outside to give an immediate impression of his subjects. He meticulously composed indoors, with the feeling of spontaneity coming through in live performance of his carefully worked out techniques. There's also the general character of Debussy's music, which seems to sonically convey the same fuzziness or ambiguity of Impressionist painting. The melodies aren't always clearly delineated. It's not clear what's a theme and what's just transitional. The harmonies are ambiguous and don't always lead anywhere. Sometimes you get very dissonant harmonies that would normally resolve to a more consonant or mellifluous sounding harmony, but he doesn't resolve them. He just kind of lets them sit there and they don't feel like they need to resolve. It's this beautiful, strange, dissonant harmony. And he's also concerned with color and shading, or at least what's rather metaphorically seen as the musical equivalent of color, the timbre of the instruments and their different combinations. As the second assessor noted, the Prix de Rome assessor that I showed you, he said that Debussy had a feeling for color, which was his way of saying that Debussy was finding new and novel ways of utilizing individual instruments or sections within the orchestra. But again, this is just metaphorical. It's not literal color. It's a metaphor we tend to use to find an analog between color in painting and color in composition. But while Debussy's music can sometimes have the same unfinished, atmospheric, or disintegrating quality of an Impressionist painting, these characteristics in his music are carefully calculated. In fact, in his piece, The Afternoon of a Faun, which is the piece we're discussing today, he spent a very long time tweaking his orchestration during the rehearsal period. He would listen to the orchestra's rehearsal and then say, oh, I actually want to pair this instrument with this instrument, or I'd rather this instrument back off a little bit. So his musical painting wasn't so much a paint the water lilies as fast as you can so you can move on to the painting of the water lilies in the afternoon versus the morning. It was slow, methodical, going back and giving a sense of spontaneity, but not during the compositional process, if that makes sense. Debussy may have certainly been emulating Impressionist art in his music. We know, for instance, that he was particularly taken by the paintings of the American artist James McNeill Whistler, who, though he rejected association with Impressionism, nevertheless exhibits its core concepts in his paintings. And I'll note here, you more likely know Whistler from his painting, which is popularly called Whistler's Mother, but I think Whistler himself called it something like Arrangement in Black and Gray. He had these very musical titles for his paintings, just like how Debussy may have been trying to emulate Whistler's paintings. Whistler, in turn, was trying to emulate music in his paintings by giving them titles like this one, Nocturne in Black and Gold. A nocturne is a piece of music that has nocturnal associations with the night. And so Debussy seems to have reappropriated this cross-media translation in his own Nocturnes for Orchestra from 1899, which many scholars have associated with Whistler's paintings, including this one. You can see how it's almost verging on abstraction, this Nocturne in Black and Gold. It's a scene of fireworks being set off, and you can see a few ghostly figures at the bottom. Sorry, I've covered some of them up. But this is a fantastic painting. I love this painting. So Whistler's seascapes also likely inspired Debussy's own symphonic seascape, La Mer, or The Sea, from 1905. But the cover of the score here, which I've shown on the right, shows another artistic influence from the visual arts, the famous Wave of Kanagawa by Hokusai. Though, in fact, this also connects Debussy with Impressionism to some extent, as the Impressionists were also greatly impressed by the art of Japan. There was a general craze for all things Japanese in Paris at the time. This is the beginnings of our Western obsession with Japan. Commodore Perry had just reopened trade with the nation, which had been closed for a couple hundreds of years, I believe. And its arts and crafts were now finally available for purchase for the first time. This was the artistic trend of Japonism, or Japanism, I guess you could translate it as, which it came to be called, with artists, especially French artists, emulating woodblock prints by Hokusai and Hiroshige, as well as furniture, kimono, screens, and other imported handicrafts. This is somewhat linked to the primitivist strain I mentioned last week, that is the rediscovery of non-Western arts among modernists. Though Debussy and the Impressionists admired Japanese art less for any supposed primitive qualities than for its sophisticated subtlety and understatement, which were qualities that they were trying to capture in their Impressionist works. So even if Debussy wasn't intentionally setting out to be a musical impressionist, which he wasn't, the Impressionist haze was certainly in the air at this time. These aims and tastes didn't solely belong to Monet and Renoir, but were floating around in the cultural air for figures like Debussy to adopt. If it's helpful for you to find a visual analog in Impressionism, then by all means, listen to Debussy while flipping through a Monet catalog or looking at your water lily poster. But keep in mind, as I said last week, that these isms are more of a helpful shorthand for describing certain impulses or qualities in a work of modernist art. They lose their utility when we start pigeonholing artists and composers into a single ism, or when we try too hard to extend an ism from one art form to another. Feel free to make these metaphors and analogies across different media by drawing similarities, as I've done here. but keep in mind the vast differences and never force a one-to-one relationship that really isn't there. What is more, by trying to force Debussy's music into the label impressionist, we might overlook more salient or productive comparison with isms in other art forms, which we might not immediately consider. And in fact, Debussy's artistic tastes were more literary than visual. Beginning as a young man at the Conservatoire, he hung out in circles of authors and poets and continued to associate with these men of letters than with fellow contemporary composers who his taste didn't quite align with. Debussy especially admired the work of poets who were dubbed symbolists, whose literary style he emulated in his music, he consciously emulated in his music, more so than the painting techniques of the Impressionists. So we'll rejoin Debussy in a moment, but for now we need to turn to one of his contemporaries, Stéphane Mallarmé, who is a major player in symbolist poetry. I'll let Mallarmé himself lay out some of the main goals of symbolism as he describes them in an interview conducted in 1891. Mallarmé says, to name an object is largely to destroy poetic enjoyment, which comes from gradual divination. Divination, you may recall that word from Harry Potter, that Professor Trelawney is the professor of divination, I think, which is telling the future. So Mallarmé here is beautifully comparing poetry to a kind of extracting the future or fortune telling in some way. He continues, the ideal is to suggest the object. It is the perfect use of this mystery which constitutes symbol. An object must be gradually evoked in order to show a state of soul, or else choose an object and from it elicit a state of soul by means of a series of decoding. Great language there. Mallarmé's poetry was, in part, a reaction to what he saw as the crude directness of realist literature, which we discussed briefly last week. He says this kind of objectivity in art is akin to simply writing down the name of a precious stone and then believing that one has literally created that jewel. Real poetry, however, requires one to delve deeply into oneself, attempting to express the inexpressible being, moods, atmospheres, and what he calls the state of soul. To achieve this poetry of the ineffable, the key literary technique symbolists employs, and from which the movement derives its name, is the symbol. But this isn't the convenient one-to-one correspondence that your high school English teachers might have taught you, that this bird symbolizes so-and-so's desire for freedom, end of story. No, these symbols in the symbolist movement have multiple overlapping and ambiguous layers of meaning, which can be largely subjective. These meanings are never obvious and are intentionally obscure. It is the work of the reader to try to unpack these meanings, perhaps uncovering subjective meanings that are significant only to the reader, him or herself. But this isn't some Dan Brown Da Vinci Code puzzle. The goal isn't to somehow decode the symbols and discover some definite secret meaning in the poem, or that there's a map on the back of the Declaration of Independence. Rather, as Mallarmé tells us, quote, there must always be enigma in poetry. The purpose of literature, the only purpose, is to evoke things. So we'll return to the use of symbols in next week's lecture when we discuss Debussy's symbolist opera Pelléas and Mélisande. But for now, we should focus on Mallarmé's art of evocation. For Mallarmé, music was the ultimate art form. Even though he was a poet, he saw music as the ultimate art form for the reasons we discussed at the end of last week's lecture. On its own, pure musical sound is neither direct nor descriptive in the way that text can be. But its ability to evoke and suggest moods and states without coming forward with a definite meaning perfectly embodied what Mallarmé was trying to do with language. In the interview with Mallarmé I read a little earlier, he says that composers don't have the need to, quote, explain everything like a realist writer might. He adds that for poets, quote, our present task precisely is to find a way of transposing the symphony to the book. And in fact, much of Mallarmé's language approaches pure sound. In many of his poems, he's less concerned with the meanings of the words than with their musical qualities, when he puts them in strange combinations that are there more for the pure sound of the language. So Mallarmé's brand of symbolism is exquisitely applied in his poem L'après-midi d'enfant, or The Afternoon of a Faun, which was published in 1876, but written about a decade earlier. This is on the left here, I've shown the elegant deluxe first edition with illustrations by Edouard Manet, not Monet, Manet, M-A-N-E-T. Some of his paintings are featured in, what do you call it, Animal Crossing. You can buy some of his paintings, but he was kind of associated with the Impressionist movement. He has some incredible paintings, but he did some drawings to illustrate this edition. Also, by the way, the one I've pictured on the left, which is an authentic first edition, sold for 10,000 euros at auction. So on the title page on the right, Mallarmé has subtitled it an eclogue. This is the English spelling here with a C, and he's using the V's to be very. This is what they would do in ancient Rome. They would use V's to represent a U. So he's being not cute, but being very old-fashioned, very classical here. So he subtitled it an eclogue. Which is a genre of poetry dealing with pastoral themes. Pastoral, the word pastoral comes from pastor, which means shepherd. Hence, a pastor in a church is the shepherd of the church. And pastoral themes deal with the countryside, with peasants, shepherds, and with mythic Greco-Roman figures associated with this setting, such as wood nymphs, nature spirits, or satyrs, which are the mischievous half man, half goat beings you've probably seen pictures of. The titular faun is not a baby deer. This isn't a poem about Bambi. Rather, it comes from the Latin word faunus, which was the name of a fertility and nature god associated with mountains and shepherds, with the pastoral. The Romans derived their faunus from the Greek original, who is named Pan, P-A-N. He's usually depicted as a satyr with the lower half of a goat, and sometimes with horns on his head, though I don't, Manet here in this illustration hasn't put the horns on there, but you can see the lower half, you can see his hoof here and his furry legs and a little tail. Isn't that cute? Actually, he's not very cute. He's usually depicted as a very sexually virile figure, though his animal side often overcomes his rational human side, leading him to uncontrollable and rapacious acts. Most famously, in myth, he lusted after a beautiful wood nymph named Syrinx, S-Y-R-I-N-X, and chased her down in an attempt to rape her. Syrinx's nymph sisters saw her in distress and transformed her into a wild reed growing in a stream. Pan grabbed at these reeds, thinking he had caught Syrinx, but found he was just clutching at a pile of reeds. But he noticed that there was a beautiful sound that the wind would produce when it passed over these reeds. And so he bound the reeds together into an instrument called a syrinx, after the nymph, or in English, it's more often called a pan flute, after Pan himself, that is Faunus, who's often depicted playing it. I'm sure you've seen him doing that. So Mallarmé's poem is about a faun. It's not about the god Faunus or Pan, as depicted in this myth that I just told you about, but rather another member of his licentious species. But it's a similar encounter that's evoked in the poem as the one in the myth. Mallarmé's faun comes upon a group of nymphs and unsuccessfully attempts to seduce them, and then reflects on this missed opportunity to couple with these supple maidens. And yet, from the first page, Mallarmé sheds some doubt on whether the whole encounter took place in the first place. The poem isn't a detailed pornographic description of the faun's run-in with the nymphs. Rather, it takes place afterwards, as he sits lazing in the afternoon sun, half asleep. He asks himself, did I love a dream? Aimais-je un rêve? And on the next page, which I haven't reproduced here, he says, might not the girls you are describing be wishful figments of your mythopoetic senses? The poem proceeds with the faun's drowsy musings on what may or may not have transpired. His narration is already established as unreliable, as Mallarmé puts here, did I love a dream? Since he was simply recounting this, what he saw in his sleep, or may not have seen in his sleep. But Mallarmé's symbolist treatment of language makes it even fuzzier and less certain. We get brief glimpses of the faun's memory that intertwine with rhapsodic passages praising the bodies of the nymphs, so that there's no clear or linear plot to speak of. It's closer to an actual daydream state, where bits of a dream or a memory might surface, elicit an emotional response, and then fade away to be replaced by another memory and a response. Though our reminiscences might not follow the exact order of events as they transpired, or we might misremember things. They might actually contradict one another. And that's what happens in the poem. Mallarmé's metaphors are especially unclear, with unusual phrases like in this first page, sommeil tofu, my bushy sleeps. This doesn't give an exact sense of how the faun slept, but rather multiplies the possibilities. The French word tofu, like the English word bushy, can refer to the density of vegetation in a forest setting or to the fluffy hair of an animal, both of which would apply in this case to both the faun himself, his body hair, and his habitat. What's more, there's an idiomatic use of the word tofu that can mean when a text is, or a book is complex or involved. Un livre tofu, a bushy book. That meaning could also apply here, both to the faun's complex dream and somewhat but also somewhat self-referentially to the way Mallarmé renders that account of that dream, rather obscurely, elliptical, and ambiguously. I highly recommend you read through the poem for yourself, which is only 4 pages long. I've uploaded it to files on our course website. If you're interested in poetry and perhaps want to incorporate this poem into your final project in some way, I would recommend that you seek out several other different English translations. Or if you know French, return to the original French. As you'd imagine, it's impossible to capture the extreme subtlety and refinement of Mallarmé's French. For example, the bushy sleeps, you can see how the multiple meanings of symbolic metaphors can only be fully appreciated with the knowledge of the original language. Also, I would add with the knowledge of original myth. But let's return to Debussy, who was an ardent admirer of Mallarmé for reasons you may already be beginning to piece together. Aspects of Debussy's music that are often labeled impressionist, and with good reason, as we saw, actually might be more symbolist. In 1890, Debussy was asked what kind of poet he prefers to set to music, and he answered, one who only hints at what is to be said. That same year, 1890, a poem that perfectly fit this bill fell into Debussy's lap, Mallarmé's Afternoon of a Faun. In fact, Mallarmé had asked Debussy to provide music for a live theatrical recitation of the poem that would happen the following year in 1891. That seems unusual by today's standards of what kind of theatrical genres still exist. But there were lots of genres like this in the late 19th century and early 20th century that combined spoken text with musical accompaniment. In fact, the most famous of these genres, most popular of these genres, was called melodrama, which was spoken text or a play or a recitation over a live orchestral accompaniment. As you could imagine, this was very, very cheesy, over the top, which is why we call soap operas and this kind of over the top acting or plots, we call them melodramatic after this this genre of melodrama. Melo meaning melody, drama. Excuse me. So it was announced that Debussy would write 3 movements for this show, this live recitation on stage, which would begin with a prelude, which is a brief piece of music that precedes something. For example, a church service or another longer section of music, like a fugue or an act of an opera. After part of the poem was recited by whatever actor was reciting it, there would be an interlude, which is like a prelude, but a piece of music coming between 2 theatrical acts or sections of music. And at the end of the poem, there would be a paraphrase finale. So again, this wasn't melodrama. It didn't seem like it would have been melodrama with someone reciting the music, reciting the poem over the music, but rather the prelude, some recitation, then a pause for more music, then the rest of the poem, and then this kind of musical summing up of the evening at the end. So we don't know much about this project. It actually fell through, but Debussy did start sketching a standalone piece of orchestral music that was inspired by the poem. Though we should note that from the piece's inception, Debussy wasn't interested in setting the text for a singer, though he did set some of Mallarmé's poems for a song cycle in the following decade. And from the titles of Prelude, Interlude, and Paraphrase, though he only retained the first of these for the final work, which is called Prélude to the Afternoon of a Faun. So these titles show that he wasn't interested in translating the poem into music by somehow sonically depicting it as if it were like a film score. And there was a symphonic genre in the 19th century called the tone poem, in which a composer would try to represent the plot of a novel or a play or a poem, but purely instrumentally. There would be no voices or text at all besides the summary of the poem's plot, the tone poem's plot, which would have been provided in the program notes that you would read before the concert. And then you could somehow imagine it in your head, like Disney's Fantasia. But this is not what Debussy is doing here. Let's remember that in his Prelude. As he himself explains, here's a quote from Debussy. "It's the poem's general impression." Again, I think he's using that word to mean not to invoke Impressionism, the artistic movement, but the general mood, the general atmosphere. It's the poem's general impression. For if I'd followed it any closer, the music would have run out of steam like a carriage horse competing for the Grand Prix with a thoroughbred. What he means by that horse metaphor is that language can do so much more than music. And if Debussy had attempted to create a tone poem based on Mallarmé's text that depicted every little scene and all their ambiguity, he wouldn't be able to express the subtlety of Mallarmé's language. Even though, remember, Mallarmé himself was trying to emulate the subtlety of music with his language. I think that's funny. Coincidentally, the piece, Debussy's piece, has as many measures as the poem has lines, but that's only mere coincidence. You shouldn't try to pick out a one-to-one correlation between the poem and the music. But this oboe solo, that's great, oboe solo, that this sounds like Jabba the Hutt, oboe solo, that this oboe solo represents this stanza. Rather, what Debussy is trying to do with Mallarmé's poem is rather close to what Mallarmé himself was trying to do with our conscious experience. That is, Debussy only wants to convey the mood or the atmosphere of the poem, allowing the listener to fill in the gaps of the music. Perhaps the listener can even daydream like the faun, picturing all sorts of erotic encounters, like those that are only hinted at in the poem, and which are even more ambiguously suggested in Debussy's music. I'm thinking especially of the gorgeous theme from the middle section of the work. The work has these three big sections, and the middle section, I'll play a little clip for you here. So there's something incredibly erotic about this passage. Not so much the soaring string melody with its wide leaps, but the way Debussy accompanies it with this oscillating motive in the woodwinds, the flute, the oboe, the clarinet. There's something almost animalistic about it. It pulsates and throbs like an uncontrollable drive or some sexual bodily sensation, which in a very symbolist way, I'll leave to your own imagination. Aside from the sexual imagery, it also conjures the sounds of nature during a hot summer day, which is when Mallarmé's poem takes place. Personally, it reminds me of the buzzing of cicadas, but it also suggests to me, again, what's called the heat shimmer, the way that the air becomes warped during a summer's day and produces a shimmery distortion of whatever is behind it. You may have seen this when you're driving along the road during a summer's day, and other times it's called a mirage, this illusion of almost like water hovering above the ground. Again, Debussy may or may not have all or none of these images in mind. Nothing here explicitly stands for anything. Or more accurately, in the spirit of symbolism, it evokes a multiplicity of meanings, some of them, like mine, filled in by the subjective listener. But you can hear how the general mood of the poem and character of the faun is being conveyed. Animalistic urges, sexual excitation, and the sultry summer weather all combine in Debussy's music to create an inexpressible yet all-pervading mood that combines all these associations and more. This is, in fact, this passage I played for you, this is the loudest and the most active that the music becomes in Debussy's Prélude. The dynamics, or the volume level, never moves beyond forte, loud, and tends to hover around piano or soft for most of the piece. In this middle section that I've sampled, Debussy teases us into believing that we're approaching some kind of orgasmic climax, either a musical climax or the imaginary sexual one we might be picturing. But you could hear how the orchestra kind of disintegrates there into a few solo instruments. Coitus interruptus, if you know what that means. Most of the piece proceeds at a lazy, near stagnant pace, and the instrumental textures are delicate and sparkling. For example, there's ample use of two harps here, an instrument that can only be heard when it's playing by itself or with just a few other instruments. There's usually only a single harp in an orchestral piece like this from this time period, and it's used sparingly just for special effects. But here it's used, it's quite often playing solo, playing with the flute. It's more prominent than in other works of this time. And it's often associated with Debussy's music. He's always using the harp in his pieces, the harp and the flute. We'll get to the flute. So another aspect of orchestration, the string players apply mutes to their instruments for much of the piece. These are little pieces of rubber. The rubber today, I don't know what material they would have been in Debussy's time, maybe leather. The little pieces you apply to the strings that dampen the sound. They don't just make the violin or the cello quieter, they can also change the timbre, the tone color, by making it sound less bright and penetrating, but darker, woodier, and more compact. And you can see how that would suit the mood of this piece. The string players also play in tremolo, which is a quick back and forth bowing technique that produces an effect like trembling or quivering, which adds to the overall shimmering quality of this piece. There are lots of woodwind solos, especially for reed instruments, like the oboe and clarinet. These are instruments that have long been associated with the pastoral themes because shepherds used to play on reed pipes. These are little folk instruments that have you play by buzzing the reed at the end of the instrument. And these are the forerunners of the modern orchestral reed woodwinds, especially the oboe. And then, of course, there's the flute, which is the most important player in this piece. Actually, the work is scored for 3 flutes, but the first flute is given an extended solo passage independently of the other 2, several extended solo passages. For the time, this was extremely unusual. The instrument to feature the flute in such a dominant position in a piece of symphonic music, and for such lengthy stretches of a piece. But what makes it even more unusual is the fact that Debussy opens the piece with just the flute, that for a full few measures, there are no other instruments playing besides the flute solo. Every time I listen to that, I'm consistently shocked at how strangely naked it sounds all by itself, exposed without any plush string pillow for it to lie on. While it's undeniably beautiful, this solo also has an eerie and otherworldly quality to it. I always get the sense that I'm overhearing some supernatural music coming out of the forest, music that's not intended for human ears, but only for nymphs and satyrs. This mysterious quality goes beyond the mere fact that the flute is playing by itself. It has to do with the very pitches being played. And I should also mention that this theme, this melody that's being played, it recurs throughout the piece, oftentimes in the flute, but played by other instruments. But for the purpose of today's lecture, we're only going to focus on these 4 little measures. So this strange dreamlike sensation that Debussy conjures is hard for me to put into words, but it's possible for me to explain why it feels so strange by applying some concepts from music theory. That is, the branch of music studies that deals with the nuts and bolts of how a piece is put together. Of course, this may seem exactly like what Mallarmé didn't want us to do. As we saw, he'd rather leave art an enigma that has no solution to it. At the same time, there's always an element of craftsmanship involved in any art form, and especially music. It's akin to making a shoe or a piece of pottery. Artworks don't just spontaneously flow out of a creator like some kind of energy. I know that's how it's depicted in movies. The music won't come anymore. I hate that stereotype because that's not how creation of artwork works. It's meticulously put together from the raw materials of sound, language, or paint. The sensations elicited by the final product might be inexpressible when you listen to it or when you're playing it, but we can still pick apart how the work was put together to start to understand why exactly it is that these pitches are prompting your indescribable reaction. So to understand the flute's opening melody, which I said recurs throughout the prelude as the main theme, we need to return literally to our ABCs, or that is the musical ABCs. So here we are at the keyboard, which more than any other Western instrument gives a succinct summary of how our musical system works. First, I need you to remember 3 terms, or rather a category and then 2 terms that are under that category. So the category is interval, which is the distance between 2 notes. The first, oh crap, our F moved. There we go. The first interval I want you to remember is called a half step, which is the distance between any 2 adjacent keys on the piano, be it white next to black, white next to white, or black next to white. And as you can see, there are no spots where we get a black key directly next to another black key. There's always a key between them. Which brings us to the next interval type, which is whole step, which is the distance between 2 pitches that spans 2 half steps. 2 half steps make a whole. So 1 half step, 2 half steps, whole step. From C to D is a whole step. C to C sharp or D flat is a half step, but a C to a D is a whole step. And this can be white to white. There are cases where it's black to white or white to black, here from E flat to F, or from black to black, F sharp to G sharp. This interval of the whole step is also called sometimes a skip. You can see it's because you skip over a note to play the next one. When you go from E flat to F, you skip over the E. So let's start with a simple C major scale, which, if you're not familiar with the pitches on the keyboard, in pink I've showed the main pitches of this scale. It ascends through 7 notes, C, D, E, F, G, A, B, and then another C on top. C. You'll notice, if you're not familiar with music, that the alphabet only goes from A through G. It doesn't go beyond G, which is why we suddenly jump from G back to A. That's because there's a cycle of pitches that's related to acoustics. This C at the top of the scale is vibrating at twice the frequency of this C at the bottom of the scale, and the same for the other pitches. But that's beyond this. Notice how conveniently the piano is laid out to visualize the C major scale specifically. The black keys are there in the specific arrangement to show where the order of whole and half steps are in a major scale, specifically in the C major scale. First, we have 2 whole steps from C to D and from D to E, or again, they're called skips because you skip over C sharp and D sharp. Then we have 1 half step from E to F, 2 adjacent white keys right next to each other. Then we have 3 whole steps, each with a black key in between them again. F to G, G to A, and A to B. And finally, the scale closes with another half step from B to C. Again, white next to white. This order of alternating whole and half steps, which is specifically whole step, half step, whole step, whole step, whole step, half. So 2 whole steps and a half, then 3 whole steps and a final half step. This order of alternating whole and half steps, this pattern, is what gives the major scale its familiar sound. We can also transpose it so that the scale starts on a different pitch than C. We simply reapply the order of whole and half steps to a different group of keys. Unfortunately, this means that the convenient white key only arrangement of the C major scale, where we don't have to deal with going into the black keys, this doesn't apply anymore. So if we start, let's say on the pitch F here, things start familiar. First we need a whole step, F to G, and G to A are whole steps. Now we need a half step. Remember, the pattern is whole, whole, half. We can't go to B here which is a skip or a whole step. Rather, we need to go to the key that's directly adjacent to this A, which would be the black key, B flat. In our scale alphabet, we've gone F, G, A, and the next letter alphabetically would be B. That's why we call this B flat and not A sharp, because we already have a pitch named A in the F major scale, F, G, A. Since we're not using this B, we call this pitch B flat rather than A sharp. Continuing up the major scale, we need 3 whole steps, remember. B flat to C places us back on the white keys. Then C to D, sorry I haven't labeled these. Then D to E. And then remember the last pitch we need, the last interval we need, is a half step. And conveniently, we have a half step here, this natural half step between the 2 white keys from E to F. Again, remember the C major scale ended with from B to C, whereas this F major scale ends with the one from E to F. As you'd imagine, or you might know if you've ever learned the scales by heart, the combinations of black and white keys can get much more complicated than the F major scale, depending on what note you're beginning with. But no matter if you're playing a simple C major scale or something with lots of black keys like C sharp major, there will always be the exact same order of whole and half steps. In particular, it's the placement of the half steps, since there's only 2 of them, that give the major scale its familiar sound, especially the final half step in the C major scale from B to C. This one, which is given this pitch that's a half step below the second to last pitch in the scale, this B, is given the special name, the leading tone, since it naturally pulls the ear towards the final pitch of the scale because it's this half step rather than the larger whole steps. It pulls us to the upper C, which returns us back to the pitch that the scale started on, although it's an octave higher. Much of the drive and the momentum of traditional music depends on the pull of that final half step, since it emphasizes the home base pitch of the major scale, the one that it starts and ends on. Listen again. And you might already hear in your head, there it is. You kind of get this anxious expectation that it's going to come. The main pitch, which gives the scale its name, is called the tonic. In C major, it's obviously C, the one that it begins and ends on. So there's a hierarchy of importance among the pitches in a major scale, with the tonic being number 1, both literally in the sense that the scale starts on it, but also because it's the most important pitch. What I'm calling traditional music is better termed tonal music. Tonality is the system of Western music that functions according to this kind of hierarchy of pitches. I could go into further what are the next important pitches, but that's beyond this course. A piece of tonal music will pull from a set of 7 notes. There are technically 8 in this scale. That's because we're repeating the C at the top and bottom, this octave. But they don't have equal importance. There's a natural pull built into the intervals of the scale, the order of whole steps and half steps, so that the other pitches seem to rotate like planets in relation to the main tonic pitch at the center of this mini solar system. Obviously, it's not at the center of the scale, it's at the beginning of the scale, but if we picture these pitches like a solar system rotating around some musical sun, that would be this pitch, at least for the C major scale. By the way, this is one of my favorite scales. It's called the https://forms.gle/scale major. And these are the individual pitches. I will read them for people who might be hard of seeing. The pinks are lowercase, the yellows are uppercase or number. So again, https://, although I think you can leave that off, forms .gle, as in the last three letters of Google, and then a /, and then type these in. Lowercase c, uppercase q, uppercase y, uppercase g, lowercase j, lowercase I, lowercase x, uppercase y, lowercase g, lowercase s, lowercase a, uppercase L, uppercase D, uppercase K, lowercase w, the number 3, and an uppercase A. Now, only an anal retentive person would stick to these rules with such rigidity. You get bored when you can only pull from 7 pitches. To some extent, the development of Western musical history for the 300 years or so preceding Debussy had been a progressive expansion of tonality of this Western tonal system, this pitch hierarchy embedded into the scale. There was a gradual pushing of tonality to its limits. Composers would experiment with seeing how far they could stray from the tonic, this home pitch, or if they could obscure its hierarchical primacy at the top as the most important pitch in a scale, but without totally erasing that natural pull I've described. One way of doing this is termed chromaticism. This is to pull from the 5 other pitches that had been ignored in the scale. Remember, in the C major scale, there were those 5 black pitches which marked they conveniently marked the whole steps in that specific scale, but they're not simply place markers. They're functioning keys that can also be played. Remember when we played F major, we had to pull from those black keys the B flat. So why not throw them into the C major mix? Is there a way that we can somehow incorporate these 5 foreign danger zone pitches, but still make it clear that we're grounded in C or whatever key, even though these pitches don't belong to the C major scale or whatever scale we're in? Again, let me emphasize that composers didn't want to totally eliminate the whole tonal hierarchy. They just wanted to stretch it, to find ways of momentarily subverting or obscuring the tonic without destroying the natural pull of the scale. The chief innovator in the realm of chromaticism during the 19th century was our old pal Richard Wagner from last week's lecture. While Debussy was embarrassed to admit it, his musical style owes a lot to Wagner's. But instead of looking at a Wagnerian instance of chromaticism, I'd like to show you an example from French opera, from a work that was written just a couple decades before Debussy's Prélude, and which he would have seen many times and had in his ear when he was composing. You'll see there's some striking similarities in this example with the flute theme from the Prélude. So this is an aria, or an operatic solo number, from the 1877 opera Samson and Delilah by Camille Saint-Saëns, who's an excellent and underrated composer. You may only know him from his Carnival of the Animals, which is this kind of joke piece that he wrote for private performance with his friends. But actually, in the last decade or so, there's been a renaissance of Saint-Saëns music and new recordings and new performances of his works. I will mention, though, that he was rather jealous of Debussy and very resistant to his younger colleagues' musical experiments. So here's that clip. So we can see here how Saint-Saëns, even though he's experimenting with chromaticism, he still clings tightly to the rules of tonality as he had been taught at the Conservatoire, even though he didn't win the Prix de Rome like Debussy. So I want to point out here that I wish I could, I tried when I recorded this in the past to use my cursor to point to parts of my my slideshow, but it wasn't lining up for some reason in Zoom. So I've kind of over labeled this example. So excuse me if this is an insult to you that I'm labeling the pitches, but since I'm not able to point with my cursor, I thought I would over label. So I've circled here the errant chromatic pitches that don't belong in the D flat major scale. Saint-Saëns is essentially descending through this scale with some added chromatic notes to make things a little spicy. This is a seduction aria in which Delilah is trying to bed the beefy Samson so that she can cut off his luscious locks, his hair that is, which are the source of his power. That's an Old Testament story from the Bible. But notice that Saint-Saëns never lets the chromatic pitches fall on the first beat of a measure, which is the strongest beat. And note that measures are notated by putting these vertical lines in the staff. So in the first measure, there's a chromatic pitch at the very end of the measure, leading to an A flat at the beginning of the second measure. Now this A flat within the D flat major scale is the second most important pitch. And unsurprisingly, we can see here how Saint-Saëns has placed it at the beginning of the second measure to give it a prominent place. And it's also an extended rhythmically, a half note plus an eighth note there. He's placing it again on the downbeat, the first beat of the measure, which is the strongest beat. Likewise, in this measure and the following measure, the second and third measures, the chromatic pitches that don't belong to D flat major are relegated to in-between beats. They never last longer than an eighth note, which is half a beat. And see how he never places them on the downbeat. Those are reserved for pitches that do belong to the D flat scale. A better metaphor than spicy for these chromatic pitches might be to call them slippery, since they add extra half steps that produce a pull toward the next pitch. Again, we saw that reserved primarily for the leading tone, that is the second to last note in a scale that lies directly below the tonic and pulls us up to the home pitch. But note that even though Saint-Saëns allows these extra half steps into his D flat scale, he never obscures the primacy of the most important half step in this scale, the one between C, the leading tone of D flat major, and then D flat itself, which is the tonic. I show you in the lower left-hand corner, I've pictured it on the piano, and you can see the half step between C, the leading tone, and D flat, the tonic. In fact, we can see just how much he emphasizes this relationship in the measure where we reach the bottom of the scale, the fourth measure. Saint-Saëns backtracks a little to G here. I've labeled the G on the half note there, but then he drops down to C, which is the leading tone of D flat major. We still feel the natural pull to D flat, but instead of returning to the D flat at the bottom of the scale, he jumps up to the one at the top of the scale. I show that jump in a yellow line there over the rest, so that he can begin the descent again. And I don't show it here, but this melody repeats. Again, this descending D flat major scale with added chromaticism. It just has a different text. So it's not technically a half step, it's an octave plus a half step, but we still feel the same upward pull from that C and the same satisfaction when we land on the D flat, the starting point, the tonic. So here's Debussy's melody from the Prélude, which has some surface similarities with Delilah's aria, including a very chromatic descending line that's filled with half steps. And I've gone through and labeled each half step for you in orange. You can see how there are parts in the melody where there are 4 in a row. This gives it an extra slippery feel. But it should be simple to apply the same logic as we did for the Saint-Saëns excerpt. I mean, Debussy tells us the key we're in right there on the left, those 4 sharps that are called the key signature. And these indicate that we are in E major. So we can expect the pitch E to be given a prominent position. But however, it only appears once in this melody. It's not even in a prominent position. It's stuck there in the second to last melody, right in the middle of a measure. It's not at the beginning of the measure, of any of the measures, as a downbeat. Okay, don't give up. There's another possibility. Those four sharps can also indicate a minor key. The minor scale has a different order of whole and half steps, which we can't get into right now. It has lots of complicated rules that are beyond our discussion here. But trust me when I say that those four sharps in the key signature at the left could also stand for the key of C sharp minor, with C sharp as its tonic. And lo and behold, the melody does indeed begin on C sharp. And that pitch is given a prominent position later in the melody. After the initial chromatic descent, we work our way back up to another C sharp on the downbeat, the strongest beat of the second measure. I've labeled that C sharp. And then it all repeats again. The descending chromatic line, the climb back up to C sharp for the downbeat of the third measure, that C sharp there. But then what's this at the end of the melody? We land on an A sharp. This pitch sometimes belongs to certain variations of the C sharp minor scale. Again, this would be way too complicated to get into right now. But it's unusual that Debussy isn't directing us towards C sharp itself to conclude this melody. Remember the way Saint-Saëns directed the motion of his melody toward his tonic? We'd expect Debussy to do that here and direct us towards a C sharp at the end of this phrase, or at least one of the more common pitches of C sharp minor. This A sharp is only used in certain variations of C sharp minor. What's more unusual is the way Debussy places a chromatic pitch that never belongs in C sharp minor in none of its variations. He places it in this pitch in a prominent position. That's the G natural, the white key G, that's at the bottom of the two descents in the first and the second measure. And I've labeled it as G natural. You can also just call it simply G, the white key G. Now, in the key of C sharp minor, the second most important pitch in the tonal hierarchy after C sharp would be G sharp. But see how Debussy just kind of blows through that pitch, G sharp, on his way down to G natural? Even though the G natural isn't in the key of C sharp minor, he emphasizes it by holding the pitch longer than the preceding ones. He also places it at the bottommost position of this descent, so your ear is drawn to it rather than the G sharp. If you're feeling a bit at sea in all this music theory, especially if you don't read music, don't fret. You're sure as heck not going to be asked to regurgitate everything I've just said. The main takeaway point here is that Debussy has started to go further into the danger zone of chromaticism. That is, the pitches that don't belong to the scale. That he's starting to blur our recognition of the tonic pitch, that is the most important pitch. We suspect that this opening flute melody is in C sharp minor, but there are enough secondary pitches and prominent positions in this melody that our center of gravity is thrown off. Our ears start to second guess whether C sharp is really the tonic. Those two other prominent pitches, that is the A sharp at the end of the melody or the G natural at the bottom of those two descents, the latter pitch is, I'll remind you, is never found in C sharp minor. These two pitches kind of distract our ear and pull us in a different tonal direction. They flirt with us to make us believe that they're actually the tonic. Once we've heard them, it's hard for us to reorient ourselves to C sharp, if that really is the key that we're in. I hope you're starting to see the overlap with Mallarmé's poetry. Debussy's flagrant disregard of any firm tonic, any stable home base pitch, creates an ambiguous sense of tonality, where we're never quite sure what the meanings of the pitches are. That is, how these pitches are functioning in relationship to one another. The stable hierarchy that we're used to, which is maintained in the Saint-Saëns piece, even though he incorporates ample chromaticism, it's starting to come apart so that three seemingly unrelated pitches, C sharp, G natural, and A sharp, all emerge as potential tonics. It's the same ambiguity and multiplicity of meaning that Mallarmé was trying to achieve in his poetry, but applied to music. On the surface, Debussy's music superficially might remind us of Impressionist art, but when we get to the nitty-gritty of the score, how he constructs a little four-measure melody for flute, we can start to recognize that at its core, his music has more in common with symbolist procedures. Again, I don't think this means that we should start calling Debussy a symbolist composer rather than an impressionist composer. Like I've said, these labels are only helpful to identify certain impulses or characteristics and should never be used to pigeonhole an artist. Before we leave this strange melody behind, I want to point out a special feature of it that seems to reference the ancient Greek themes of Mallarmé's original poem. So I brought up the Saint-Saëns aria because of the similar shape of the melody, this descending line. Also, I forgot to mention that they both start on the same pitch, although Debussy calls it C sharp, whereas Saint-Saëns spells it as D flat. But we can see how they're not exactly the same, how Saint-Saëns starts at the top of the D flat major scale and then descends and then kind of jumps back up to descend again. But Debussy, by contrast, kind of oscillates up and down, retracing his path upward before he descends again. Sometimes he even goes a little crazy, ascending and descending through multiple quick oscillations several times in a row, like you can see at this later passage, where the two flute players pass the melody back and forth. Sounds like one of those Batman motives, the transitions. I know I said that the piece is an evocation of the general mood or atmosphere of the poem, but this melodic motion is undoubtedly an allusion to the faun's trademark instrument, the panpipe or the syrinx, which we discussed earlier. So in this passage of the quick up and down oscillations, it's like the faun is quickly blowing back and forth on his pipes, going up and down the scale. We can even gauge his level of alertness in the piece by how vigorous the panpipe motive is. At the beginning, when he's at his drowsiest and most lazy, the tempo is very relaxed and the rhythms are irregular and almost improvisatory. In fact, I'll mention here quickly that the theme, this flute theme, never appears the same way twice. That there's always little variations in the rhythm or in the pitches. But here at the beginning, in this first iteration, you get the sense that this satyr, this faun, is just absentmindedly tooting on his pipes while he's thinking about the nymphs. So Debussy's highly chromatic melody, which we saw doesn't seem to follow the rules of Western tonality, we might think of it as an imaginary recreation of some ancient musical scale. Indeed, the ancient Greeks had their own system of scales or modes that were being rediscovered around the time that Debussy composed the Prélude. I think that instead of trying to cram Debussy's flute theme into Western tonality to try and figure out which pitches don't belong, we should think of this as an imaginary scale full of half steps, many more than in the Western scale. But this pan flute that the faun is playing consists of these pitches, and the faun is simply playing the pitches that are available on his flute. I mentioned in the last lecture that modernism doesn't always look forward to the future. It can look backwards, as Debussy seems to be doing here. The faun's animalistic sexuality and supernatural origins could never be captured in a garden variety major or minor scale. Rather, the faun's nature is better conveyed in some alien sounding music that seems to be some ancient and foreign to the listeners, like something they've never heard before. This isn't so much a form of exoticization or Orientalism, which were colonialist modes of representation, of representing other cultures during the 19th century. Rather, this seems to be a creative reimagining of the ancient Greek past as a means of tapping into the kinds of themes associated with that time. Particularly through this ancient sounding music, Debussy is channeling the kind of uninhibited earthly sensuality that's linked with the mythical faun figure, which is so far removed from the prudish sexual morality of 19th century Europe. Though I will add the caveat that the faun's attempted rape sits a little less comfortably with us today, even if this only occurred in a dream. And this actually might be an aspect for you to comment on your final project if you select this piece. Wardrobe change, new day, new me. So what makes Debussy and Mallarmé's re-engagement with ancient Greece modernist is that they're reviving the more sensual and animalistic side of this culture, rather than dealing with themes of, say, heroism or the classical aesthetic of balance and beauty, which had been the parts of ancient Greece that earlier artists of the 19th century and before had emulated. We also see this in the third and final leg of the adaptation chain that we've slowly been laying out today, which is the choreography of Václav Nijinsky for his 1912 ballet of The Afternoon of the Faun. Now, Nijinsky was a very young Russian ballet dancer of Polish descent. He was in his early 20s when he choreographed his ballet of the Faun for its Paris premiere. Nijinsky, though younger than Debussy, came from a comparable educational background associated with a conservative institution. In his case, it was the Imperial Ballet School of St. Petersburg, which is associated with the fabled Mariinsky Theater, the premier institution of ballet and opera in Russia. Once Nijinsky graduated from the academy to become a full member of the Mariinsky troupe, he and many of his young ballerina and ballerino colleagues, much like Debussy in Paris, became frustrated with the stylistic constraints of classical ballet in the 19th century. The choreography they were using consisted of ready-made steps that were reapplied to totally different dramatic situations. The evening-length ballets they performed, like Tchaikovsky's 1890 Sleeping Beauty, were merely vehicles for virtuosity. They consisted mostly of solo numbers for the big ballerina stars, and these solo numbers might be loosely connected with some pantomime scenes to move the plot along very quickly. While Tchaikovsky wrote some lovely music, which you probably know from the Disney film, it's used in that, the last act is absolutely idiotic. It's a Shrek-like assembly of fairy tale creatures, each one of them performing their character dances, including these little, I think it's called the pas de chat, the cat step for Puss in Boots, where you put your little paws up. Very, very silly. You can see how ballet had become kind of mass entertainment and a little bit idiotic. And so in 1909, a group of Russian dancers from the Mariinsky broke away, and led by the producer Sergei Diaghilev, they formed a new touring company called the Ballet Russe. Note that it's plural. There's an S at the end of ballet and a Russe. So it's the Russian ballets, not the Russian ballet. Sometimes it's misprinted. Not a big deal, but it'll make it easier to search it online. More often, rather than producer, you'll hear Diaghilev referred to as an impresario, which it indicates that his leadership is both as a manager and an artistic director who's at the head of the Ballet Russe. And Diaghilev was indeed worthy of that title. He managed to breathe new life into ballet, a theatrical genre that was stagnating in Europe and Russia of the time. He did this by featuring daring new choreographers like Michel Fokine, Leonid Massin, and Nijinsky, whom we're discussing here today. These choreographers totally reinvented the art form of Western ballet and laid the foundations for modern dance as we know it today. So the Ballet Russe, while it was a traveling kind of group, it tended to center its operations in Paris, which, as you'll remember, this was the hotbed of modernism, where all the exciting things in the arts were going on in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. And they were a huge hit in Paris. Their productions were the must-see events among the chic Parisian crowd of the 1910s and 20s. In fact, new styles and fashions of clothing and design emerged that were directly inspired by the innovative artists and costumers who would collaborate with the company. The audiences especially ate up the whole exotic spectacle of the ballets that they performed, which were often on Orientalist themes. So this was an example of this kind of colonialist attitude of depicting this exotic East, this Orient. For instance, their 1910 ballet Scheherazade, with music by Nikolai Rimsky-Korsakov, was inspired by the Arabian Nights stories and took place in an exotic harem setting designed by the artist Leon Bakst. And here's Bakst's set design for that. You can see how sumptuous it was. Nijinsky was especially popular in this ballet as the sexy slave boy. He was painted all in gold makeup, and the choreography by Fokine, not by Nijinsky, by this other choreographer Fokine, emphasized the character's dangerous male sexual energy. So ballet had been dominated by female dancers until now, and the choreography had emphasized feminine grace and poise. And in fact, the ballet in Paris had for years, not the Ballet Russe, but the official French ballet, had for years been implicit in pimping out young women, the corps de ballet dancers who were always on display on stage, not just for entertainment, but as sexually available. And wealthy male Parisian aristocrats would flirt with the ballerinas at intermission and then take them home afterwards. There was even a whole room devoted to this, the Salon de Ballet, I think it was called. So you can imagine how exciting and novel this shift in gender dynamics of ballet would have been for audiences. And Nijinsky, as one of the lead soloists of the Ballet Russe, really embodied this new emphasis on masculine sexual energy in dance. So it's become a tired cliche to say this about Nijinsky, but his leaps and grand jetés seemed to last forever, as if he were suspended in midair. At the same time, there was something almost supernatural about his movement and his physical beauty that defies gender. For instance, he was one of the few male dancers who could dance on point, on tippy toe. The tip, well, not on the actual toe. There's these little wooden pieces in the shoes, but that was a technique that had only been practiced by female dancers, not by male dancers, and yet Nijinsky was capable of this. Here's a fantastic quotation from the leading scholar of the Ballet Russe, Lynn Garafola, whose book on the history of the company of the Ballet Russe I've posted on our site if you're interested in reading about it. So she says, masculine in the power of his leaps, feminine in the curving delicacy of his arms, he emitted a perfume of sexual strangeness. He seemed a living incarnation of the third sex, a Uranian reveling in the liberation of his true self. And I've showed these two photographs, one of Nijinsky as the Rose in Le Spectre de la Rose, and then this painting by Bakst, the designer who did the Scheherazade set, which shows these kind of these masculine and feminine sides to Nijinsky. So while Michel Fokine, the choreographer who did Scheherazade, the ballet that Nijinsky starred in, Fokine was initially the main choreographer of the troupe, though he left in 1912, and there was room for hot new talent like Nijinsky to step in and contribute creatively, not just as a dancer. So the company's repertoire consisted of shorter pieces, no longer than a half hour. So there were lots of opportunities to produce new choreography, especially when Diaghilev started seeking out composers, especially up-and-coming modernist composers, to write pieces especially for the Ballet Russe to dance. For these reasons, the Ballet Russe is without a doubt the most important institution in advancing the cause of modernist art in Europe of the early 20th century, especially modernist music. And we'll return to their repertoire a couple of other times in our course. Now, note that Debussy's Prélude to the Afternoon of a Faun premiered in 1894, over a decade before the formation of the Ballet Russe. It was a standalone orchestral piece, or rather, as we saw, it kind of started as this part of a stage work or recitation of the poem, but then it became this kind of concert piece. It wasn't intended for a ballet production. He didn't have dance in mind as he was composing. But Diaghilev and Nijinsky, who, by the way, had become lovers by this point, they saw this short 9-minute piece, Debussy's short 9-minute piece, as an ideal addition to the Ballet Russe repertoire. In fact, they started conceiving of this project while they were vacationing in Greece with the artist Leon Bakst, who you've seen a couple works by. He designed the exotic Scheherazade set, and then he would go on to design the set and costumes for Nijinsky's Faun ballet. Now, I've been reiterating over and over throughout this lecture that Mallarmé's and Debussy's was an art of evocation and ambiguity, never coming out and fully defining a poetic image or a key area, a musical key area, that is, but keeping the language or the musical texture free-flowing and vague. In light of this, some of the artistic and choreographic choices that Nijinsky made may not seem to gel with his two predecessors' creations, or at least not initially. First, there's the fact that Nijinsky, who was no doubt assisted by Diaghilev in the creation of this ballet, that he imposed something of a concrete plot onto Mallarmé's hazy evocation of a dream. This was obviously for the sake of convenience. There had to be some semblance of a story for the audience to be able to follow. They were used to things like Tchaikovsky's Sleeping Beauty. Plus, it would have been difficult to convey through dance the same scattered consciousness of the original poem, the way Mallarmé does by interrupting linearity, the way he drifts imperceptibly between different layers of consciousness, from memory to reverie to reflection. So while Mallarmé's poem is retrospective, with the faun remembering the events that transpired either in reality or in his dream, Nijinsky's ballet gives a vision of these events happening in that moment. But I think that compared to something like Sleeping Beauty, the plot of which could be nicely summarized in a theater program, the cat comes out and does his dance, Nijinsky and Diaghilev's faun is as close to being plotless as it could be. So here's a general outline, though, if we do have to impose some kind of plot. It's more of a description of what people are doing on stage than a story or a plot. So the faun sits on his rock, basking in the afternoon sun and playing his pipe. A group of nymphs, more than in the original poem, but you need to feature more dancers for a ballet troupe. A group of nymphs enters, and one of them, who we'll call the lead nymph, she starts to undress for a bath. The faun, aroused by the sight of the near-naked nymph, scares the others away. He and the head nymph dance a pas de deux in which she keeps trying to cover herself up with the dress that she's removed. The head nymph manages to slip away, and her sisters re-enter to chastise the faun for his predatory actions. The faun, left alone, picks up a veil that the head nymph had left behind, takes it back with him to his rock, where he smells it and lays it down. He slowly lays himself prostrate. He slowly lays himself prostrate on the veil, and with a quick little arching of the back and thrusting of his pelvis, he ejaculates onto the veil before falling asleep. So obviously, for the time period, that would have been a rather shocking gesture. And in fact, Nijinsky had to tone it down a bit. The original choreography was, I read, was a little bit more explicit. I don't know exactly it entailed, and the one you see now with what I just described is his later change to it. It's less explicit, but I still think it still retains some of its shocking quality, especially within the context of this opera or this ballet that's over 100 years old. That it has this display of onanism is a little bit more of a polite way of referring to that. So aside from the general plot, if you can call it that, of Mallarmé's poem, certain key images from the text reappear as props in the choreography. Notably, there's the flute that Mallarmé describes his faune playing. Given our earlier discussion, you'll no doubt notice that it's not a panpipe that he's playing, but a reed pipe, a double reed pipe. This is a different instrument and closer to the one that Mallarmé actually describes in his poem. He says it has two pipes, which is the ancient Greek aulos, like the one that the satyr is playing on this vase on the right. We can be almost certain that Debussy has reimagined the faune playing the panpipe rather than the aulos, since the panpipe is a kind of transverse flute. It makes it sound by you blow across the hole. So the modern day flute sounds closer to a panpipe than it would to the aulos. Since the aulos has a double reed, you make the sound, rather than blowing across a hole, you make the sound by vibrating these two reeds between your lips. And that would sound something more like a modern day oboe. So while Debussy has a panpipe in mind, we can see how Nijinsky, the prop that he used was, and he was very specific about what kind of a pipe he wanted. It's closer to the aulos that of Mallarmé's poem. There's also the grapes that Mallarmé describes, which the faun holds up to admire at the beginning of the ballet, as he does in the poem, as I've put the excerpt there. Note that in many contemporary performances of that are still done today of this ballet, the faun is shown devouring the grapes rather grotesquely. He opens his mouth wide and kind of drags the grapes along his face. However, this was something that was added at a later date. Nijinsky's original choreography had been handed down orally through the years. It's like a game of telephone, one dancer passing it on to the next, and aspects of it were inevitably changed or tweaked, either purposefully or accidentally. Now, there existed a score to Nijinsky's choreography in which he used musical notation, but reapplied it to dance steps to show the position of the body and the arms, etc. He used a musical staff and notes, but they didn't represent music. They represented gestures and choreography. But this notation, a private notation that was his own creation, remained indecipherable until the late 1980s, when the dance scholar Anne Hutchinson Guest finally cracked the code. So we know now what the original choreography would have looked like, which is why I mentioned that there were counterfeit versions floating around online. Although some of these versions might not be so much fake versions than some variation of the choreography that had been handed down orally, like I mentioned. At any rate, the two videos that I've placed on the course site are the closest that I could find to the original, at least the original as described by Guest. If you're going to choose this piece for your final project and you'd like to know how the original choreography was like, you should read the very detailed measure-by-measure description that Guest provides in her book on page 33. I've placed it in the files section of the site, our course site, and she also describes how she went about deciphering it. It's pretty interesting. You should also take a look at the 1912 photographs of Nijinsky and the other dancers taken by Adolf de Meyer, which Hutchinson, she consulted these photographs during her restoration of the original choreography. There's two of the photographs here. So what was this choreography like? Well, you may have already been getting a sense from the Meyer photographs I've been showing you just how sidelong the gestures and body positions were. Recall that Nijinsky and Diaghilev had come up with the idea for their ballet while in Greece, where they would have seen examples of ancient red and black pottery with mythic figures depicted in the kinds of poses Nijinsky would replicate in his choreography. In fact, and I apologize for the somewhat graphic nature of these pots, satyrs, these faun figures, were popular subjects in this kind of poetry. There are many pornographic examples that show satyrs attempting to rape women, though these aren't nymphs, but human maenad women participating in the Bacchanalia ritual. But you can see how similar this scenario is to the plot of The Afternoon of the Faun. So Nijinsky placed his torso facing almost outward to the audience, while the legs faced either right or left in the direction of travel. The dancers are always moving along a single horizontal axis to create the illusion of flatness, as if you were seeing one of these Greek vases come to life. You can see from Nijinsky's bird's-eye view diagram here of the set, how he emphasized this sense of flatness by pushing the set all the way to the front of the stage, or the front half of the stage, hence all the empty space on top there. That's the back half of the stage. And he also had the dancers only move in the narrow band of stage bracketed as number 2 here. The little steps there, that's the steps up to the faun's rock. The hands and arms became especially angular and flat, with lots of triangular shapes in the arms and very stiff, almost phallic hand positions for Nijinsky, who sticks out his thumb rather suggestively. Also notice the feet. They're bare for the wood nymphs to suit the woodland primordial setting, though this would have been extremely unusual for the time, as ballerinas always wore their little silk slippers. While Nijinsky had on gold sandals, he angles his feet in such a manner to create the illusion that he has hooves like a satyr, emphasizing the animalistic nature of his character, which we've seen expressed in the throbbing of Debussy's music. So while the stiff flatness of Nijinsky's choreography, while fascinating and groundbreaking, you can imagine just how out of the ordinary this seemed for people used to the poses of classical ballet. Though it might strike you as at odds with the aesthetic of Debussy's score and Mallarmé's original poem, the set and costume designs by Leon Bakst might seem a better visual analog to the music than what Nijinsky had created choreographically, which isn't so much a choreographed dance than a series of static gestures or poses. There's none of the flowing arabesque quality of Debussy's textures. Perhaps if you personally re-choreograph this ballet, you'd seek out a more flexible style of dance that better reflects the character of the score. But that's not to say that Nijinsky's contribution is totally antithetical or resistant to Debussy. In fact, we've seen one way already that Nijinsky's ancient Greek aesthetic might align with Debussy's. Recall Debussy's flute solo, this highly chromatic panpipe figure that seems to stand in for some imaginary ancient musical scale. With his Grecian urn gestures, Nijinsky is attempting a comparable resurrection of the archaic past, in particular, the uninhibited sexuality associated with ancient Greece. The figures in the ballet are supernatural or part animal, and their sexual encounters remain ambiguous. The pas de deux between the nymph of the faun is, unsurprisingly, danced into the middle section of Debussy's score, the one I played before with the soaring string melody, the passage that's accompanied by the throbbing woodwind gesture that's so suggestive of summer heat and erotic sensations. Nijinsky's choreography for this middle dance is ambiguous. While the situation initially appears predatory, with the nymph resisting the faun and covering herself with her dress, she eventually drops the veil and the two dance in various interlocking poses, as if she were giving herself over to him, or at least considering it. Obviously, this ambiguous consent doesn't sit comfortably with us in the present day. And as I've mentioned, you may choose to comment on this in your project if you choose The Afternoon of a Faun. But I want to close today by offering another point to consider regarding the work's strong erotic undertones. Nijinsky, as I mentioned, was in a relationship with Diaghilev. While he had sexual encounters with women that he enjoyed, and he eventually married a woman, I wouldn't go so far as to start placing contemporary labels like bisexual on him. Though, given the character he's depicting, a pan, maybe pansexual might be a better label. At any rate, Nijinsky seems to have had a fair degree of sexual fluidity. No doubt the sexual openness of the ancient Greeks would have resonated with him. The fact that ancient Greek men could be married to women, but also carry on relationships with boys. I'll also note that symbolist writers like Charles Baudelaire, as well as Debussy's friend Pierre Louis, were exploring themes of lesbianism in their poetry, finding erotic inspiration in the ancient Greek poet Sappho, who in her poetry, she describes female same-sex love, hence the term lesbian, since Sappho hailed from the Greek isle of Lesbos, which is a theme of this poem here by Charles Baudelaire in his poetry collection, Les Fleurs du Mal, the Flowers of Evil, which is full of sadism and sexuality and magic and Satanism. It's the beginnings of the symbolist movement. He had these 3 lesbian themed poems, which, as you'd imagine, were all censored and all cut from the final version. This is 1857. But here he has this poem, Lesbos, which mentions Sappho in it. There's no doubt an element of female objectification in these male poets' descriptions of their idea of lesbian love. And by today's standards, their poetry will seem as misogynistic as Nijinsky's casual depiction of rape. Yet what I want to emphasize here is the fact that, however misguidedly, these modernist artists were attempting to express taboo forms of alternative sexuality. There were no artistic models in the late 19th century and early 20th century European art forms for depicting this kind of forbidden love, since these practices weren't only frowned upon, but were punishable by law. Most famously, the playwright Oscar Wilde was imprisoned for his homosexuality. Therefore, early modernist artists sought out the distant past, rediscovering in ancient Greek art modes of representing freer and more flexible sexual mores, albeit one that veers too far into sexual predation for our contemporary tastes. But I'd argue that still today, Nijinsky's final masturbatory spasm remains a thrilling and liberatory gesture, placing his sexuality nakedly on stage for adoring audiences to drink up. All right, guys, that ends today's lecture. I'm so excited to rejoin you guys next week on another fascinating symbolist work by Debussy, his Pelléas et Mélisande. And there will be instructions on which sections to listen to. And I'll rejoin you then. Adios.